Alright everybody, welcome back to the channel, the main event here. And today we're going to be going over the strengths and weakness of different restricted Pokemon in Regulation G. Because we don't have time for all of them, we're going to focus on the restricted with at least one top 8 appearance in the previous Reg G iteration that we had last year. So it only had to have one between all the Reg G events, right? So Zacian, I think, just had one. Koraidon, for example, had like 3. Kyogre had a couple. So like there's at least 8 Pokemon on this list. Depending on how long this recording takes, and maybe I'll speed run through the rest of the restricteds really quickly. But I do have notes for these I want to go over. So we're going to start the video with Zacian. Question of the day: which restricted do you have the most trouble facing when you play your Reg G games? Hopefully this list helps you, deal with them a little bit better, or help you learn how to play the restricted you enjoy even more. So starting with Zacian. Its biggest strengths, in my opinion, are its speed and its immediate pressure on lead. At 148, it's the second fastest restricted overall behind Caly Shadow, making it the second fastest Pokemon you're likely to run into in the format, behind Caly Shadow as well. There are faster Pokemon, but again, this is about what you're likely to see versus unlikely to see. The Zacian's immediate pressure and lead starts off with its ability. Intrepid Sword, giving it a +1. This ability was nerfed this generation. But it's still a strong ability, right? You get an immediate choice band boost as soon as you put this Pokemon on the field. And with the speed and its high base power moves like Behemoth Blade and also Play Rough, you get really, really high damage pressure on turn 1 on lead without any additional setup. And with its speed, you don't always require much speed control. So you're kind of just ready to just hit the gas, so to speak. Also gets a lot of really good coverage, right? So I already mentioned Behemoth Blade and Play Rough, but also gets like Sacred Sword, for example. That's not how you spell sacred. I apologize. If you go over here to the physical category, you see that it gets like a close combat, facade firefight. It gets a lot of coverage moves, which is nice, right? Because you can kind of use this to, I didn't even know it got Trailblaze, but you can use this to basically get any kind of coverage that you need based on your team development. These are its most common coverage moves. Stab, and something to hit opposing steel types with, basically, right? So yeah, really, really great coverage moves as well. It's also very versatile in the Terra types that it can use. For example, you can use like Stellar on this Pokemon very, very easily, right? One of the few Pokemon where Stellar actually works, because you have like 3 moves that all can get boosted through the Stellar Terra, plus the Intrepid Sword, and then you're gonna do a ton of damage. Also, it can use defensive terras like Water and Grass. Water if you want to like resist fire move and resist like Urshifu, Rapid Strike, things of that nature. Grass if you want to resist like Lando Eye. Ground moves if you want to ignore Mungus, right? So you have like a lot of options. You can even go with like Fire Terror if you want to resist fire and also not deal with any burns. Like it's one of the really, really strong users of Terastallization in this format. And even before Terastallization, naturally it is just like the best typing in the game, right? Fairy Steel is the best typing combination you can probably have. Best typing is just the best typing overall. Like Fairy's probably the best typing, still might be the second best depending on who you ask. But putting them together is really, really awesome. It gives it 9 resist and 2 immunities, immune to dragon and poison. And it gives it 9 resist, right? So with that, plus it's like defensive stats with 115 defensive and a decent HP stat as well. It's actually very hard to get rid of for a Pokemon that's so strong. Which is why it was like so dominant in Gen 8, right? Even with like Dynamax, it did so much damage and it wasn't easy to get rid of without super effective moves. It can 1-tap a lot of opponents, and at worst it 2-shots most things with neutral hits. So like this Pokemon is still very strong, and it just hasn't been able to keep up as much. Which brings me into the weaknesses. I think its biggest weakness right now is that it cannot hold an item. I think items are more important this gen than they have been in a long time. So like for example, this Pokemon can't use the Clear Amulet, so its Intrepid Sword boost can get wiped away by Incineroar, which is going to be probably the most used Pokemon in this format, if not have consistent top 3 usage. The ability nerf also makes it harder to want to switch out and lose your boost. Losing your boost is not great. Yeah, its attack stat is still very high, but that boost is what really puts it over the top, and it allows it to keep up with stronger Pokemon. So not being able to do that is really, really, really unfortunate for this Pokemon, because you could switch it out in previous gens and bring it back in and still get your boost and you would be just fine, which is not great. Additionally, as bulky as this Pokemon is, there are bulkier options actually. like a lot bulkier options, right? So like even like with its great stats, there are Pokemon that just kind of stat check it just a little bit on the defensive end. And even kind of on the offensive end, if we're being totally honest. And we'll get to some of those in this list as well. And lastly, I think one of the big weaknesses of the Pokemon is that it essentially has 4 slots and wants 5. This is a Pokemon that you kind of need to have Protect on. And you kind of need to have a Behemoth Blade and one of these 2 moves at least, but you also want to run like Swords Dance, right? For because you don't have the Intrepid Sword that stays. So you kind of also want to run Swords Dance, but then you lose your Steel type coverage, or you go with Sacred Sword, and then you lose your Fairy type coverage, right? So it's kind of, you kind of have to make a sacrifice somewhere on this mon. Whereas other mons where they just kind of use their attacks, they kind of just like 4 is enough. This Pokemon really does need an extra slot because its coverage offensively needs to hit certain things, and it's really difficult. And a lot of Pokemon do suffer from that, but like you're restricted, you don't want it to be quote unquote restricted in that way all the time if you can help it. So next up is Zamazenta. I'm gonna try to do these in pairs where it's permitted. So Zamazenta, while it doesn't have the perfect defensive typing that Zacian does, it trades that off for having an additional 50 points placed into its bulk stats. So instead of the 115 defenses, it has 140. So 25 increase here, 25 increase there, same HP stat. So it does have much more natural bulk, typing notwithstanding, which is a big benefit to its longevity in these really high powered restricted matches. This is compounded by the +1 defensive stat it gains from Dauntless Shield on lead. Dauntless Shield also cannot be intimidated the way Intrepid Sword can. So your +1 is more likely to stay on the field than Zacian is. My apologies. Not to mention, it uses this stat for its best move, Body Press, making this Pokemon arguably have the easiest time against Incineroar out of like almost all the restricteds, sans maybe Kyogre. Place where Zacian and the other restrictors do struggle immensely, right? A lot of the restricted Pokemon struggle with Incineroar specifically, but Zamazenta really just kind of picks it apart, which is really big advantage in a format where, again, Incineroar will probably be the #1 most used Pokemon, if not top 3. Because of its ability, its move pool and its stats also has an easy time staying on the field, soaking up hits and dealing damage. Again, in a format where the power level is so high and things can go by quickly, Zamazenta has no issues making it all the way to the end of the match and dishing out as much damage as it can because it gets as many turns as it can to land hits. It doesn't mention the fact that it comes out with 8 resistances and an immunity of its own, with its Steel typing. Steel obviously just being like the best defensive typing in the game usually on its own. And Fighting being a good offensive typing itself. I also want to quickly mention that with Heavy Slam and Body Press being its moves of choice along with Protect, its last slot is pretty flexible, right? Because you run those 3 moves, so you can put things like Wide Guard here. You can put things like Iron Defense. You can do like look through its coverage and find some kind of niche maybe that you may need. It gets a lot of like moves. It gets like Helping Hand, which is something I don't think you would want to run in single restricted, but maybe in double restricted you do run it. So you see that it has like additional moves that it can use. It has Roar. Like that 3rd spot is so flexible, which is I think a huge advantage for this Pokemon. For other Pokemon that need to use specific things in all of its 4 spots. So Zamazenta does have weaknesses as well though, and it mostly comes from its offenses. As good as Body Press is, it is easy to evade or resist, right? Because it's resisted by Flying, by Fairy, by Psychic, by Poison, and it's evaded completely by Ghost, right? Which is not the best things to not be able to hit in this format, because there's a lot of Terra Fairy. There's going to be a number of flying types with like the Weather Genies. Obviously, Ghost is a strong typing with Fluttermane and Caly Shadow. Psychic, again, Caly Shadow, Caly Ice, even though that's obviously a dual typing, but you guys get my point. And Poison Terrors, which sometimes is just in this format as well. And Heavy Slam doesn't hit Fire, Water, Steel, or Electric, which is also, again, like Fire, Water, Steel, Electric. These are definitely types you're going to run into a ton. Obviously, they cover for each other with Steel because Body Press does hit Steel, which is a good benefit, but like Body Press doesn't hit any of these other types, are super effective. So it does run into to some struggles with being able to deal big damage to targets. Not to mention in a restricted format where the biggest threats are all very heavy. Heavy Slam base power gets like reduced. Whereas it's 120 to most normal Pokemon, it gets a lot of the restricted. It gets knocked down to like 80. This creates a situation where Zamazenta can be easily walled and relies super heavily on its teammates to hit opponents that it can't. Basically, Zamazenta is a tank build and not a carry build, which basically means it's not meant to come out and lead the team in damage and kill everything, but mostly there to soak up all the hits, which it does very well. But again, it relies heavily on its teammates, and if all your teammates get KO'd, you could be put in a situation where Zamazenta cannot hit anything and you just lose the game. Next up is Kyogre. One of Kyogre's biggest strengths is that it sets its own weather in a format where it's not always going to be overwritten. Between the other Kyogres and the number of Pelipper that you'll find in this format, Rain is likely to just stay on the field very, very often. And Rain for this Pokemon essentially equals a Choice Specs boost, right? Because you get a 1.5 times boost in Rain to your water type moves, which is Kyogre's main source of damage. And it does this without the need for holding an item. Kyogre has two of the most broken moves ever in Water Spout and Origin Pulse. Both spread moves, both very high base power, both boosted by Stab and both boosted by the Rain coming off Kyogre's 150 base special attack. Two of the most broken water moves they've ever made, even with Origin Pulse is a mischance. Because they're both spread moves, it lowers the need to like have to target anything. So like you don't have to use like Hydro Pump or whatever. You can just use these for the most part. Water also is generally a very, very good defensive typing. Only being hit super effective by Grass and Electric. This with very strong special bulk, as you see, it's 140 special bulk with 100 HP, makes it very hard to get rid of with like special hits. And decent support. 90 is not bad defensively, obviously. So you can like use this thing to actually soak up some hits and get off as many attacks as you can. And because you have a free item slot, you can be versatile in your items. Some people prefer like Choice Scarf to get the speed boost because it's 90 is not fast enough a lot of times to get off the full power water spouts. So you need some kind of speed control. We can go Mystic Water. Some psychopaths go with like Choice Specs. Those people just want to see the world be flooded. That's pretty much like what Kyogre does best, right? It just sets up the weather and it just clicks damage until it can't click damage anymore. It's very, very straightforward kind of Pokemon. There's not really much thought that goes into it other than like protecting its HP for Water Spout. So I mentioned that it only gets hit super effective by Grass and Electric, which brings me into its first weakness. Grass and Electric are everywhere in this format, right? Raging Bolt, Rillaboom, and Ogerpon are very, very heavy meta staples. And they give Kyogre like a lot of trouble, like so much trouble. And you don't really want your restricted to struggle with like regular Pokemon that much, at least not that many, right? But like I mentioned, a lot of them struggle with Incineroar, which obviously Kyogre has a great matchup into. But it's really, really bad into Raging Bolt, Rillaboom, and Ogerpon, especially like the AV versions of Rillaboom and Raging Bolt. Kyogre just cannot hurt them at all, and it's really, really bad. Like its coverage doesn't hit nearly as hard as its water type moves, especially if you're running like a Choice Scarf because you're not getting a boosting item, or if you're running the Mystic Water, you're not getting a boost on those other things. So you need like a Life Orb or Specs, which makes Kyogre a bit tougher to use, in my opinion, right? And even its best moves do have caveats. Like Spout, you gotta have a high HP number in order to get the most out of it. And Origin Pulse will miss. I'm not gonna say it can miss, it will miss. Origin Pulse will miss. It doesn't have access to Scald or any single target reliable water moves. I want to say its best water type move is Hydro Pump. So if we go here, right, go to the water type moves and you just go like the single target ones. Like Chilling Water is basically that's garbage. Hydro Pump is less accurate than Origin Pulse, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so like you just never would run Hydro Pump over O-Pulse, which is very, very unfortunate because it needs some kind of single target move. It doesn't get Scald anymore, like I said. Muddy Water is the same accuracy as O-Pulse, but it's like weaker, so it's just no point. Surf hits your teammate, and your teammate will also die because Kyogre is very, very strong. So its best moves still have these like big drawbacks, which is kind of unfortunate because other Pokemon get to click big 120 base power moves without any kind of drawback at all. Whereas this 110 base power move has a huge drawback, which is very, very unfortunate. For single target, a lot of people run like Ice Beam, or Thunder. And again, when you click Water Spout or Pulse or something, you see the damage, and you think, okay, I can still do a lot of damage with these moves. These don't hit that hard compared to these two because of the non-stab, and they're not boosted by rain, and they're likely not boosted by your item being Scarf and Mystic Water as well. Even like clicking this into like Raging Bolt just doesn't do enough like damage to win that matchup. Thunder is very strong, but like it relies heavily on the rain being up. And if you're running Thunder, you're very likely a Choice Scarf set. And if you're locked into Thunder and rain goes off, or if something comes on the field that Thunder doesn't hit, you're kind of a really, really bad spot. And like Kyogre really wants the rain to set up to stay up. So in the rare chances that it does go down, Kyogre will struggle without it, which is very unfortunate for the big whale. All right, so next up is Terapagos, aka Terapagos. Please don't ask. Its two biggest strengths are Terra Shell and Terra Starstorm, in my opinion. Terra Shell, which makes the first hit of, oh, actually, no, I want to correct that. It's not the first hit. Terra Shell makes any hit resisted as long as you're at full HP. Basically meaning that your Terapagos in Terrestrial form will never be one shot outside of the most extreme circumstances, right? Meaning you will always get at least one turn. Sans getting like doubled up into to set up or get an attack off in most situations. Again, most. There are ways around this, right? Doubling into it, faking out and attacking it, turning off the ability. There are ways, or just overwhelming the ability with like the biggest damage calc you've ever seen. Again, there are ways, but in most situations, you will always get that first turn off. This makes Protected King strategies very, very viable. Basically, Protected King strategies are like, we have like one dominant Pokemon on the field, and everything else's job is just to protect and support that Pokemon. So you'll see with this mod, it'll have like Instant and Rillaboom with it, maybe Comfey, something that can heal it and thinks they can fake out the opposing side and keep it safe. Redirection next to it, Friend Guard. They're very, very viable with this Pokemon specifically because you get that free turn on the beginning. Healing to get the Terra Shell back, like I mentioned, with stuff like Comfey, just has higher value than it even does with regular Pokemon, where it already has very high value. Because again, getting that Terra Shell back multiple times just makes this Pokemon very hard to get off the field. Terra Starstorm gives it access to a 120 base power single target move, which is very, very good. And then it becomes a 120 spread move upon terrestrialization, which is again also very, very good. Terapagos Stellar Form also has the Terraform ability, which eliminates terrain and weather immediately once you terrestrialize. So like grassy terrain, electric terrain, sun, water, it's not water, sun and rain. Once this Pokemon terrestrializes and goes into that stellar form, it will immediately get rid of those on the turn that it does it, and doesn't ban them from coming back, so you can't switch out and get them back up. But like getting rid of like those before taking a Grassy Glide hit, or before taking like an Electro Drift, or before, you know, taking a Water Spout or something, is actually very, very advantageous for itself and for the team. And in a format where you will see 2 terrains and 1 to 2 weathers, that's very, very valuable ability. And just having 2 abilities is always just going to be an advantage over mons that have like 1 ability. And lastly, for this guy, Terra Starstorm hits the opposing terrestrialized Postum. Terra Starstorm hits other terrestrialized Pokemon for super effective damage, which is massive, as there will be an opposing Terra in every single match that you play. It also helps because normals don't hit things for super effective. So like having the ability to basically turn that off and hit something for super effective is a really big plus that it gets over other normal types. Now its weakness though comes in the fact that it is mostly useless if you don't save the Terra for it. If you look at its stats, right? Like these are not the stats of like a restricted Pokemon, I would say. Like I think Raging Bolt is better than this by a lot. Like its special attack is 105, which is not the number you want your restricted Pokemon to have. So sometimes it can hit like a wet noodle when it's not boosted by like Calm Minds and Terrestrialize, or using like choice specs. It requires that booster setup, which makes it a bit predictable, which would be okay if it were more immediately threatening, but it's not immediately threatening, right? So while you do get that 1 turn, you need it really badly because you are not threatening when you send this Pokemon out right away. Like I said, unless you're running something like a choice specs, And then like choice specs also also gives you another set of problems, because you then like you lock yourself into spread Terra Starstorm, and then they have a Wyguard user. Your Pokemon is essentially in the field, not able to do any damage at all, which is really unfortunate for this Pokemon. And you're restricted, can't do anything. You just have to get it off the field. Not to mention, if you Terrasilize immediately on turn 1, you do become more susceptible to being knocked out right away by strong, super effective hits like Close Combat. Its coverage moves also don't hit particularly hard outside of like Meteor Beam. Unless you have a few turns of setup, and even if you have a few turns of setup, its coverage moves still don't hit that great, because again, coming up this 105 special attack stat, it's just not that good. It does get some coverage moves besides Meteor Beam, like Dark Pulse. It runs sometimes to hit like those pesky ghosts and Earth Power. But if you ever use this Pokemon, you know these moves without like a few turns of combine setup, they just don't hit hard enough at all, which is a very, very big weakness for your restricted Pokemon. You want to be able to hit things hard no matter what you're clicking for the most part. All right, so we're gonna get into the meat and potatoes really quickly. Caly Ice is up next. So we talk about like strengths. Obviously, Caly Ice has a ton of them. Starting with its stats. Its stats are the real strength of this Pokemon. Its base stat total is like 680, if I remember correctly. Yes, it's 680. And not only is that it has high base stat, because a lot of Pokemon have high base stats, right? But they are distributed wonderfully. Like attack stat 165, special attack that it doesn't use only 85. So it's not being like wasted. Or it's not wasted in speed stat, which is only 50, right? It's not like they don't make it like a weird 65, 70 speed stat, like which might be actually not that bad, but still, it's not wasted in the speed stat for a Pokemon that's obviously meant to be played in Trick Room. The base 165 attack stat is the highest attack stat you'll run into in this format, because no one uses Kyogre Black, so which has 170. So it also takes good advantage of this stat with high base power moves. Obviously its best one being Glacial Lance. And for coverage, usually runs high horsepower, which is base 95, which is really good for coverage, or Close Combat, which is really good for coverage. So it has these base power moves. Glacial Lance is a 120 spread move with stab, so you do a ton of damage to both targets. Not to mention Ice is a very good like offensive typing. And then with the coverage of high horsepower, and Close Combat, you hit steel types, and you hit fire types with high horsepower specifically, which is usually very hard to cover for, because Ice doesn't hit those. Ice does hit most things very hard, dealing super effective damage into flying, grass, dragon, and ground. Flying, grass, dragon, and ground are 4 very common types in this format as well. So you will be hitting things for super effective damage, which is really, really awesome. It makes it really hard for opponents to play around this Pokemon if they don't have like fire and steel types. And even if they do, you have the coverage moves that do a lot. Then its ability, as one, gives you Unnerve, which doesn't allow the opposing Pokemon to eat berries, which is like not great on its own, but as a secondary ability, it's actually really annoying because you can't eat like your citrus berry and stuff like that. But Chilling Neigh is the big one, which gives you an attack boost after a KO. And with the Clear Amulet, you're never gonna like just lose those boosts for the most part, right? You're gonna get those +1s, and you're not gonna get intimidated down back to neutral. So you're just gonna keep growing and growing and growing. And its immense bulk as well means you are likely to need to switch it out very often, because you can take those hits. You have time to heal. You have time to recover with like grass. If you have grass training for you, like there are ways to get your health back. And with your bulk, you're just not taking a lot of damage. Most things are going to be 3-hit KOs, 4-hit KOs. So you're going to get a lot of chances to swing the Glacial Lance. Also, another strength that it has is speed control. Calyrex is one of those rare Trick Room sweepers that sets its own Trick Room so it doesn't need to switch in or out once it's set up, which is a big advantage. It's not like one of those Trick Room setters that when you set Trick Room, now it's on the field doing nothing. It's also not a Pokemon that needs to switch in safely like an Ursaluna, for example, because it's already on the field when you set it, and it's already very strong immediately. So it's very, very threatening as soon as you place it on the field, which is a big advantage that not a lot of Trick Room Pokemon have, and not a lot of just Pokemon have in general. Its weaknesses, and these Pokemon do have weaknesses, right? Even if you don't see them all the time right away, but they do have weaknesses, even if they are covered by their strengths so bad that they're essentially hidden. They do exist, and let's talk about it. So the psychic typing on this mon is essentially useless. It doesn't really offer you much defensively. It actually gives you weaknesses. You don't have the room to run Psychic Stab. And like, while it makes you neutral to fighting, for example, as an ice type, it contributes to the mon having like 6 total weaknesses, right? Which include Dark, Ghost, and Bug. Because of the psychic typing, you're weak to Dark, Ghost, and Bug. This stat demon, Behemoth, is weak to bug type attacks, right? That's kind of dumb when you think about it. It's kind of silly. And it only grants a resistance to Psychic, giving this mon 2 resistance total. Now maybe you probably say like, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe Caly Ice doesn't need more resist because it has so much bulk. But which I, you know, maybe I'd be inclined to agree with you, but like the psychic typing of this mon literally just doesn't do anything for it. Additionally, with the mon being slow, while it has an advantage in Trick Room, it kind of makes it where you are a step behind other restricteds like on the leads, right? And it can sometimes be a disadvantage. It's not something that's gonna like make this Pokemon terrible all of a sudden, but it is sometimes a disadvantage because whereas you have to set up Trick Room, or you have to wait a turn to attack, or not wait a turn, but you have to wait till the opponent goes first all the time. With your big bulk, if they can hit you with something strong enough to 2-shot you, it puts you at a disadvantage essentially with your restricted Pokemon. And again, like I said, these are not the weaknesses that make this Pokemon useless or anything, but they are things that you should be noting when using it. And lastly, because it is hard to find real detrimental weaknesses for this Pokemon because it's just so strong, Caly Ice doesn't really get access to its vast move pool. It has moves like Crunch, moves like Seed Bomb, moves like Zed Headbutt, moves like Heavy Slam, all moves that it could use very effectively. Because it needs Trick Room and Protect most of the time. It needs to have Glacial Lance, right? You can't run this Pokemon without using Glacial Lance, and you kind of need Protect, and you kind of want to get Trick Room, have it Trick Room on it, right? You want to be able to set your speed control up at any time you want. And it needs a move to hit Instant. And that's like the 3rd time we mentioned Instant in this video, but it needs a move to hit Instant with. Or it gets walled off by the cat completely, right? If you run like Dark and Ice, you can't hit Incineroar at all. So you need to be able to hit the cat with either close combat or high horsepower. I think maybe there's some room for innovation where you drop either Trick Room or Protect and run a different move. Because something like Seed Bomb will be so good for this guy because it hits the water types for super effective, which would be really, really nice. But yeah, it doesn't really get to use all those moves because it needs to have those 4. And lastly, it is with base 50, it's very slow, but it's an awkward speed tier where like it can still be undersped and Trick Room by like Amoonguss, Torkoal, stuff like Hatterene that no one really uses, but you guys get the point. It can be undersped by like Ursaluna. It can be undersped by Iron Hands, depending on how you EV and how they EV it, right? So you might have a 31 stat, they might have a 0 stat. And then if you have a 0 stat, maybe they have a 31 and they outspeed you outside of Trick Room, right? So it kind of makes these awkward, it's in a very awkward speed tier, which can make things a little bit more difficult. Next up is Caly Shadow. Oh boy, Caly Shadow. Start with the strengths as we have been. Similar to Caly Ice, the stats here are off the charts. Again, identical 680 base stats, and they are placed right where they need to be. And it's 150 speed, making it the fastest base speed you're likely to run into, as no one uses Reg G except Blake and my other boy from Canada. And it's 165 base special attack, which is also the highest you'll see in the format because no one uses Kyurem White either. I'm beginning to notice a theme here. Similar to Caly Ice, Astral Barrage is a $90, a 120 base power spread move that hits both targets. And Ghost is one of the best typings in the game. Hitting anything for neutral that isn't dark or normal. And I know, like I said, like normal, not hitting anything for super effective and only hitting stuff for neutral. But like with Ghost, you hit stuff for super effective, right? You hit Ghost types, you hit Psychic types. And not to mention that this Pokemon is just way stronger. This mon over Caly Ice, however, does have the ability to use the Psychic typing to use moves like Psychic, Side Shock, and E-Force with Stab for increased damage, which also only doesn't hit Dark types and Steel types, right? So like this Pokemon doesn't, like it's hard to resist this Pokemon outside of just having like a Dark type, right? Steel types don't do it because you have the Ghost Stab. This Pokemon being as fast and as strong as it is makes it so Astral Barrage on turn 1 most of the time is just like free damage on the board. Like you could just click this thing on turn 1 and it's hardly ever a bad move because you're going to get a lot of damage down and there's not much your opponent can really do about it. Yeah, because you're just so unlikely to get outsped. Even by some Choice Scarf Pokemon. I was trying like Regidrago. Regidrago Choice Scarf doesn't even like outspeed this guy. Also, this Pokemon has Deceptive Bulk, emphasis on deceptive bulk, which you don't normally find in Pokemon this fast and strong, right? Like you look at like Fluttermane, which is very fast and strong, like absurdly fast and strong. Like it's a HP and defense stat is like terrible. They're meant to be glass cannons, but Caly Shadow doesn't struggle much to take hits from a lot of the regular Pokemon in the game. And again, emphasis on regular. Something I haven't mentioned before is Caly Shadow is almost uniquely takes the biggest advantage of the neutral Terra types, probably. And by neutral, I mean types that don't always grant it power or a full resistance, but typings that make it neutral to many of its targets and foes. Like water, for example, is really good in this. And water doesn't really grant it like a bunch of immunities or resistances that it needs with like psychic and ghost. It doesn't grant it any power. And there's also like fairy. And obviously, like fairy resists dark, but it doesn't resist ghost, and it's neutral to every other type. And like it uses dark, but like dark again, while it resists ghost, it doesn't like boost any of its like normal moves that it likes to carry. Here fairy might resist Draining Kiss, but Draining Kiss is a very weak move on its own anyway. So yeah, like it's a very, very versatile as Terra types. We've seen fairy, water, dark, normal. Like we've seen a ton of different Terra types that this Pokemon get to take advantage of. Now, weaknesses, just like Terapagos, and again, this is not necessarily a bad thing because it is your restricted Pokemon. It is a bit of a Terra hog. So it's something that is worth noting. Like you should probably anticipate holding your Terra for this thing. The reason for this is that Ghost and Psychic is actually like one of the worst defensive typings ever. It's really, really bad. Granting you 4 times weaknesses to Dark, and more importantly, 4 times weakness to Ghost. This brings me to my next point, which is that this Pokemon probably has the most toxic mirror match in the game. Caly Shadow versus Caly Shadow, when Terra isn't available, will almost always come down to a speed tie, and they both one-shot the other very easily, right? So it's a coin flip who wins rather than like player skill. Maybe you could argue that player skill is letting it get down to that situation, but sometimes you just can't help it, right? Because your opponent has a Caly Shadow, maybe you have something else on your side of the field that needs to resist, right? So like it just kind of comes down to that, and you're willing to more gamble on the speed tie. But again, games coming down all the time to speed ties like that is just not very healthy for the game or the Pokemon, in my opinion. So that, speaking of one shots, that brings me to my third point. Is remember when I said that it takes it from regular Pokemon to emphasize regular? Caly Shadow can be one shot by many Pokemon like on this list, and I'm very serious. Like run the calcs. Like it can die to like Water Spout and Rain. It can die straight up to Behemoth Blade, for example. Flare Blitz from Koraidon, what you see is coming up next, can kill it. These are all neutral moves, right? These are all not super effective. And conversely, it doesn't really one-shot a lot of these Pokemon back. Like it doesn't one-shot Kyogre. It doesn't one-shot Zacian, for example. Astro Mirage doesn't one-shot, obviously, like Terapagos because they can't touch it. So like there are some drawbacks. There are some drawbacks, not many, obviously, because that's the end of the list, but there are some. Lastly, we get into the Gen 9 dragons. Let's start with Koraidon. Koraidon's biggest strength, in my opinion, are all of his moves do big amount of damage and they're difficult to resist. So like Collision Course, for example, 100 base power fighting type move with no drawbacks, and it does 33% extra damage on super effective hits, right? So like cough, cough, Incineroar, watch out for that big wheel. It's coming to run you over, boss. Flare Blitz is essentially its strongest move though. Considering that Koraidon sets its own sun, and the sun gives you the 1.5 times boost, which is essentially like the same as Staff, right? Also, its most common Terra type is Fire, which also boosts Flare Blitz again. So again, Flare Blitz is generally always going to be its strongest move. But Collision Course is still very strong and doesn't have like recoil the way Flare Blitz does. Not only does the sun boost the Flare Blitz, but also boosts its attack stat due to its ability Orichalcum Pulse, which boosts its attack stat by 33% in the sun. Unlike many of the mons on this list as well, Koraidon only has 3 moves it generally must have, which are Blitz, Collision Course, and Protect, meaning that again, for like unlike a lot of the mons on the list, his last spot is pretty flexible. You can put moves like U-turn for pivoting. You can use Flame Charge to give yourself additional speed. You can use Breaking Swipe for damage reduction, and you can use one move I think is underexplored on this guy, which is Scale Shot. Being a Sunsetter also opens up options for Sun teams and for photosynthesis boosted teammates. However, this can be a bit one-dimensional sometimes, as this is typically the team comp that it likes to run. But again, boosting like Raging Bolt, Flutter Mane, and Chi-Yu is never really a bad thing either. Like this Pokemon with Flutter Mane, Chi-Yu, Raging Bolt, and this got 2 top 8s in Los Angeles. And I think that team comp also like won in Korea. Was it Korea or was it China? It was one of those. I'll double check for you guys. But it won the national championships overseas. I used the team on the channel, if you guys remember. So Koraidon stats, while great overall, there are dozens of Pokemon with higher base stat totals and higher attack stats. Now, those Pokemon don't have the ability to boost their own attack. But as we see with Zacian, relying on an ability to increase your stats, especially one that can be easily removed, often makes the Pokemon more difficult to use overall. Like, for example, Iron Hands has a higher base attack stat than this Pokemon does. And Iron Hands is just like a regular Paradox Pokemon, right? Koraidon has good bulk, very, very good bulk, but it doesn't take advantage of it for 2 reasons. One, and that is weak to Fairy by 4 times. Psychic is weak to Dragon, it's weak to Ice, and it's weak to Flying, right? They also call this Pokemon to be a bit of a Terra Hog, and its Terra of Fire being needed to boost its offense and defense has made the Pokemon very one-dimensional. You don't really see much Terras outside of Fire for this guy because there is this Fairy and it also boosts Flare Blitz, right? So that's kind of just the terrestrialization of choice. The second reason is that Koraidon is in a very crowded speed tier of 135 with Flutter, Pow, and Miraidon. All mons that can one-shot Koraidon given situation, meaning it mostly runs full speed and full attack EVs to keep up. So you can't really invest in the bulk very much. Also, the mon just lose insanely hard to Pelipper. Shout out to Lorenzo for reminding me of that. And that is very unfortunate restricted. Like, you don't know how bad it is that your restricted Pokemon just gets negged by Pelipper. If Pelipper switches in, Koraidon can't hit it for big damage with Flare Blitz or with Collision Course, right? And with the Sun off, it reduces the attack. So like even if you have a move like Dragon Claw, for example, that's not going to do that much damage to Pelipper. It turns off the weather, so it also negs your teammates' stats as well. And Pelipper Hurricane one-taps it. And then if it Terra Fires, Pelipper Weather Ball one-taps it. So that is just not something that you want to be dealing with your restricted Pokemon, and it's so unfortunate because this guy is so cool. So lastly, we're going to get to Miraidon. Miraidon, World Championship restricted, obviously has a number of strengths. Way more than its counterpart Koraidon, even though they're supposed to be equals in terms of stats and abilities. Miraidon has an engine set to electric terrain and gives it a special attack boost at the same time. This instantly makes it different to Koraidon in a number of ways. One, setting electric terrain gives it not just a special attack boost, but also a boost with the electric type stab moves that Miraidon likes to use, sending its damage way off the charts immediately, even without specialization. Also, being a special attacker means it's less likely to want to hold a Clear Amulet because it doesn't need one. It can hold items like Life Orb and Choice Specs to boost its output even further. Miraidon also gets to use both its stabs effectively with Draco Meteor or Depulse as well, right? So it gets to use both Electric and Dragon. It gets to use both its stabs very, very effectively. Whereas like Koraidon hasn't as of this point has not taken advantage of his Dragon typing at all. Foreshadowing into the weaknesses, where Koraidon struggles without Sun, Miraidon also has no issues really keeping terrain active, as it gets a stab, pivot move, and Volt Switch, which does big damage. Like, have you ever taken a Volt Switch from this thing? And like, it does so much freaking damage for no reason. And it does big damage, and it gets it off the field. So it gets it off the field, and then you come back in and reactivate your terrain. Which also lets you use like Choice Specs pretty effectively as well, right? Because you can Volt Switch out, switch your move. So like people like to protect on you. You just click Volt Switch, and then you get off the field, and you figure it out. Miraidon also has a ton of versatility in its coverage options. It gets Dazzling Gleam, and it gets like Overheat, for example. Like Dazzling Gleam is a wonderful move for this Pokemon. It gives it a spread option. It gives it a neutral option to a lot of targets. Overheat gives you a big one-time damage burst into like Steel types and Grass types, which this Pokemon doesn't deal with as well if you're like to electric moves. As well as other spread options like Discharge. Again, so you take advantage of stab and get another spread option. You also have your teammate though, so be wary of that. I haven't even mentioned Electro Drift, which is a base 100 power move with no drawbacks that also does damage equal to Draco Meteor into neutral targets, right? So like if a target is not hit by super effective and you have terrain up, yes, electric drift hits for the same amount of damage as Draco Meteor does. So with this, like, also it does more damage than super effective hits as well. So like, so water types just get negged. Flying types just get negged. Obviously they get negged anyway, but they get super negged. So with this damage output, it's self-sustainability with Volt Switch, and even its flexibility to use EVs a little bit more freely, because it can take a bit out of special attack. Sometimes people run it modest, or they take a little bit out of speed anyway. So it just kind of works out with this Pokemon a little bit better. This Pokemon, there's no surprise that it won Worlds. And it beats Pelipper. No struggles with the bird, unlike his brother, unfortunately. Miraidon's weaknesses, while they are a few, they do exist. I know I harped on how it can pivot out to reset terrain, but it does make it where you can't always reliably click your other buttons, right? Because you kind of have to click Volt Switch to keep your terrain up all the time. Also, being so fast, other terrain setters do take priority over this Pokemon. So Rillaboom and Didi get priority on lead, right? If you just lead Rillaboom and Didi, and they lead them Miraidon, then all of a sudden they just don't have terrain, and it cuts the damage output a lot because the electric moves are no longer boosted, and the special attack number is also no longer boosted, right? Making it much more manageable, and it gives your opponent a turn to make more decisions without getting like nuked immediately on the leads. Additionally, like previously mentioned, it is also in that 135 speed tier. Speed type games are abysmal to deal with, especially since a lot of them do like to run modest for damage, meaning they'll always be a step behind those faster mons like Chiyu and Pal, which both threaten this Pokemon immensely. And not to mention, the speed types with other Miraidons are probably the second most toxic ones. Like, who's gonna Terra Fairy? He's gonna click Draco. Is he gonna Electro Drift into my Terra? Am I not gonna Terra? He's gonna Draco me? Like, it's so mind gamey, and I despise it. But yeah, Miraidon in addition to terrain, also does tend to have relies on choice specs for the damage output to kind of make Volt Switch worth clicking even more. So your opponents can play to end games where you're locked into electric move versus a ground type, or a dragon move versus fairy type, or a non-stat move like Gleam without terrain. Like, you can play around it and get it in those really dire situations. So yeah, I'm not sure how long this video has been. I'll go over it. This is probably gonna be the end. If I do speed run the others, it'll be after this portion. But if not, let me know if you want to see me do this again for the other restrictions in the comments below. Otherwise, let me know what you guys think of this video. I want to thank you guys for being here, watching it to the end. Thank you guys for being subscribed. Let me know what you guys think of the little Goldango in the corner, because he's a cool little guy. Let me know if you want the face cam back. I think I'll do face cam back for battle videos. And for these discussion ones, it'll just be little Goldango in the corner. And like any showdown related stuff, it'll be little Goldango or something. Otherwise, again, thank you guys for being here. Subscribe if you're new. Become a membership, and you get a little Goldango badge by your team, by your name, by your comments. I'm bumbling because I've been talking for way too long, but it's the end of the video, so I can be a little bit messed up. Also, I do team remakes for people. So if you send me a team, I will review it, and I will send it back to you with some versions I think are ways to improve it. This is for members. So yeah. Anyway, thank you guys for being here. Thanks you guys for being subscribed. Click like, free boy, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.